Our Catholic faith has always been countercultural. Our Lord, along with countless followers, were all put to death for their adherence to her teachings. The world around us says that we should keep our beliefs to ourselves whenever they go against the tyranny of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We fear speaking truth because now, unfortunately, truth is in the minority. Congress just passed a bill where stating something as basic as the biblical teaching of who killed Jesus could land you in jail. As we saw during the pandemic, too many bishops were not leaders at all. They were motivated by fear of being sued, fear of being removed, fear of being disliked. They showed by their actions, intentional or unintentional, that the sacraments don't actually matter. Because of this, countless people died alone without access to the sacraments.
The collage of clips you just watched are from a now viral speech given by Harrison Butker, who is a member of the Kansas City Chiefs football team that has, of course, made a lot of people on both sides of the aisle either happy or angry. Indeed, Butker is facing several calls for cancellation from many people on left-wing factions, and he is also facing a great deal of praise from people on the right. How do we make sense of all of this? Because when these kinds of things happen, a lot of people, depending on what we believe, depending on what our political predisposition is, we are motivated to go to one side or the other. Now, as someone who is most definitely a conservative in the American constitutionalist sense, there's a lot of what Butker said that I agree with, but what I don't like, and I'll address this later on in the video, is when people on the right or people on the left are expected to hate or expected to like what the opposing side hates or what the opposing side likes, depending on the time of the day. That is not a way to coherently view social issues, nor is it a way to coherently understand politics. Now, Butker, as I mentioned a moment ago, is facing calls to be kicked off of his team. There is a petition that has over 20,000 signatories that is calling for him to be kicked off of his team. The Kansas City Star, the flagship newspaper of the region that he lives in, wrote an opinion piece basically calling for him not only to be fired, but to be replaced by a woman to redress for his thought crime, so to speak. I will quote for this piece, quote, "For poetic justice, after Harrison Butker's Neanderthal outburst, and because the pipeline of talent is real, the next Kansas City Chiefs kicker should be a woman." And it continues, "The Chiefs need to make a strategic call about Butker's future with the team. If he could agree to shut his mouth, the current story might fade." Now, let me just say this. What I just read to you is one of the most odious examples of the philosophy of thought crimes and authoritarianism that I think I have read in a very long time. Two things need to be made before I move on to my observations about Butker's speech. Number one, my first observation is very simple. The reaction, especially the reaction from the left, criticizing Butker for making what is very much, I would say, a generic traditionalist speech is absolutely outrageous. He should not be canceled. He should not be fired. He is entitled to his own opinions. And nothing he said was beyond the pale or beyond really what a lot of Americans or many Americans of a certain religious disposition or a certain political disposition actually believe. I think that this response is indicative of just how horrifically close the Overton window has shifted towards a normalization of authoritarianism and thought crimes, and also, not only that, but a normalization of censorship that has happened in this culture. So I absolutely do not think the response to Butker is warranted. It is 100% ridiculous. When you do not make responses on the basis of reason, but you instead rely on your own predispositions or your own emotions to assess the validity of a claim, then you are the problem, and you cannot at all make any rational assessment on anything. The problem is this: if we had an intellectual culture of the mind that emphasized engaging with your opponent's viewpoints by stillmanning them and by being charitable to them, by using those two principles, I think a lot of the outrage that we see in our culture, from both sides of the aisle, but in this case on the left, wouldn't actually be in existence. It would be much more muted, because we could actually deal with things by talking them out and analyzing them with a rational mind to them. Now, having said that, there's another observation I want to make, and I may lose some of you here. The right has a horrible habit of making heroes out of people the left hates. They did this with Bill Maher. Bill Maher was supposed to be the cool left-wing guy who is not all woke and therefore is okay, even though Bill Maher still holds a worldview that is antithetical to the ethos of America. And Bill Maher, by virtue of his status and by virtue of many of his past positions, still retains a lot of ideas that are fundamentally anti-conservative. But because he's okay on one or two things, he must be okay. Piers Morgan, I remember this. I remember being a little boy watching Piers Morgan Tonight on CNN. Piers Morgan spent much of his career in American media advocating for the abolition of the basic right of self-preservation, which is expressed in the American context with the Second Amendment. He spent day after day, night after night on his TV show advocating against that and arguing for more gun controls and more gun bans. And yet, Piers Morgan becomes anti-woke, and all of a sudden the right embraces him and loves him. The problem is this, my friends. When you make a hero out of someone simply because your enemy hates them, you are falling into what I call the friend-enemy distinction. This is a principle that's actually quite prominent in many circles on the right, which is slowly gaining mainstream attraction, unfortunately. I wish it wouldn't. But the friend-enemy distinction was a theory posited by the political theorist Carl Schmitt, which basically says that all of politics can be reduced between who is your friend and who is your enemy. That means values don't really matter in the meaningful sense, right? Principles don't really matter in a meaningful sense. What matters is who is strategically on your side and who is against you, even if those who are on your side might differ from you in some significant ways. And this mentality has become manifest on the right because they just embrace people. They embrace people who seem to be their friends without regard truly to the truth of the content of their message. I'm not saying this is entirely happening with Harrison Butker, but I'm saying part of it is absolutely happening with Harrison Butker. Because on the right, there is this broad movement that you have to support Harrison Butker. If you don't, you must indeed support the cultural vanguard leftists that seek to tear down, censor, and install authoritarianism. But I reject the dichotomy. I think that it's important for all of us to weigh the opinions of someone on the basis of those opinions, on the basis of the merits of their opinions, and to do so in accordance with first principles, and not to do so merely because our personal tribe happens to like that person, or our personal tribe happens to see some great value in that person. No one, not even those we can consider heroes, should be above reproach. Because this discourse, political discourse, is not about personalities, or at least it shouldn't be. It should be about the pursuit of truth by talking about ideas. And man is merely a vessel for ideas that are higher than himself. Until we can realize that, we will continue to fall into this trap of idolatry, of idol worship, that limits our political horizons, limits our epistemic thinking, and leads us towards blind, sheepish tribalism, which we should all reject. Now, on to Butker's speech itself. I'll be very brief here. There are good things about Butker's speech, and there are bad things about Butker's speech. Let me start off with the good things. Number one, some of his advice is just objectively good. I mean, Butker made a very, very intentional attempt to embrace intellectual courage in the face of a censorious mob and a willingness to speak one's own moral convictions in the absence of social approval. He mentioned that numerous times in his speech, and that is a good thing, that regardless of what your religion is, regardless of what your politics is, you should be able to embrace that 100%. Number one, he also affirmed the importance of family, which is great, and the importance of eternal things, eternal values, over the accumulation of material status. And if you think about that, this is actually a fundamentally pro-America point, because America was a rejection of the material status of the old world, which was bound up in caste systems, bound up in familial bloodline ties getting you standing in society, bound up in nobility, bound up in feudal systems, and said no, the fundamental organizing principle of a proper society, of a free society, has to be contract, because contract is the only medium by which values can be expressed. Anything else is a sort of predetermined system that shackles man to a kind of slavery which rejects his potential. So no, Butker's mention of that particular thing is fundamentally American and it should be praised 100%. I clap for that. Not only that, but I also think that his willingness to defend the unborn and condemn abortion, and also condemn the fact that a Catholic, Joe Biden, would have the audacity to support abortion, which 100% violates the Catholic worldview, is also courageous. It is also proper. Now, on to my disagreements. My disagreements are numerous. First of all, Butker made a mention in his speech that the women should step into the role of being homemakers. And he actually, in a roundabout way, discouraged the women in the audience of his speech from focusing on career advancement and focusing on that kind of thing in order for them to go ahead and make the home. Now, it is not wise to go before a group of achievers that just spent 3 to 4 years acquiring skills for the workforce and then direct the women in that crowd to focus on being stay-at-home, traditionalist wives, homemakers, so to speak. Butker invoked his own personal relationship with his wife to justify this relationship for other people, but this falls into a flaw that a lot of traditionalists actually tend to make all the time. The practicability of gender roles, which is what Butker is describing, is not universal, meaning it does not work for everyone in every case. And the kind of woman he was talking to in his speech, who went to college to accrue skills and better themselves in terms of their career prospects, is not the kind of woman who will stay at home and be a homemaker. I'm not saying that being a career woman and being a homemaker are mutually exclusive. I think there's a tension. I think that in terms of, if you look at the finitude of the human experience and the fact that we can only allocate so much time to particular things, there is a tension, but it's not impossible. It's difficult. But one of those things negates the other of those things. Being a homemaker solely would then imply that you don't focus on career whatsoever. Again, this arrangement may work very well for Butker and his wife. I'm not trashing it. If you want to do that with your wife or your partner or whatever, go for it. But for him to offer this advice to career-oriented people who just got out of college is not wise. And I would have advised him if I was his friend not to do that. That's not a good idea. Now, to continue this point, Butker's recommendation reflects something a little bit more fundamental. It reflects a kind of economic illiteracy. And here's what I mean. Not every family can afford the kind of traditionalist homemaker wife, breadwinner husband model that has been accepted as common and normal for so many years. No, not every household can afford for one single person to undertake the cost of the entire household. A true pro-family perspective would encourage a kind of productive synergy between both partners, both husband and wife or whoever else is in the household, to levy their skills to bolster the household and bolster their well-being in a way that conforms to the demands of their time. The cost of living in the 1950s, where a few cents could get you a whole loaf of bread or something, is not the same cost of living in the current economy that we have, where inflation and tariffs and sanctions and supply line disruptions have made everything worse, and Keynesian economics has been the dominant mode of thought. That kind of economy prices out the kind of living arrangement that was common in the 50s. It's fine to take from the past and learn from the past, but it is not fine to use the past as a blinder to shield you from the demands of the present. I believe Abraham Lincoln said something quite similar. This is a deeper point here. Your traditions are only as good as the eternal truths they embody. If your traditions are based on unquestioned habits that you accept merely because a lot of people before you actually embraced those habits, and they are not centered on the strong ground of first principles, they will be eventually undone by other habits or by the truth, whichever comes first. Traditionalists refuse to recognize this at their own peril. Conservatism is not about blindly following the past. The American conservative project is almost entirely about, wholly concerned with, taking the truths of the past, those which are eternal, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, natural law, reason as a value, consent of the governed, all kind of different things, the inherent value of men, and then applying them to the present day in a manner that respects the conditions of the present day, and also respects the abilities of the people applying them. Butker doesn't really get this. And that's a problem. And traditionalists ignore this at their own peril. Again, your traditions are made void by the truth. If you want to take from traditions, which I do in many cases, they must be anchored on something more than simply having been products of habit. And far too many people will romanticize the 50s and say, weren't those the good old days? Well, with childhood mortality, we had higher cancer rates, you had people dying in car accidents more, you had a lot of kind of degeneracy happening in the culture, swinging culture was big back then. Of course, compared to now, the quality of life was better in some cases in the 50s. But just because people did things in the 50s does not mean those things are inherently virtuous or good. The curse of romanticism blinds man from being able to consider the merits and the flaws of past eras, and he only exemplifies the merits of those eras and tries to apply them towards the past. This is a kind of trying to manifest heaven onto earth that is quite foolish and also quite naive. Now, there are some other criticisms that I have of the speech. I'm not against IVF. As a matter of that, I myself am a Protestant, and this is nothing to note. Butker's speech was made for a Catholic audience, addressing Catholic issues that are happening with the Catholic faith. So this speech was not made for everybody. I'm a Protestant. My intellectual forefathers, John Locke, Samuel Pufendorf, Hugo Grotius, Lord Kane, you guys may not know these names, but they were instrumental, many of their ideas, in the formation of America. They were also Protestants, and they had tension with Catholics. Although I respect everybody, I don't have any tension with anyone just because they're Catholic or whatever, but I'm a Protestant. So a lot of the things he said was not meant for me, but they were meant for somebody. And so when you don't understand the very principle of knowing your audience, and you then take what someone says and you try to apply it to everybody in all cases, you will end up disappointed because it wasn't meant for you. It was meant for someone else. So that's another observation that I think really exemplifies the level of rage being directed towards Butker. My overall takeaway from this speech is that no one is above reproach and that everyone should be subject to criticism. The right has a horrible habit of making heroes out of people just because the left hates them. That has to stop. We should only make heroes out of people who exemplify virtue, who exemplify truth, and who are acting in accordance to first principles. In many cases, Butker's speech was doing just that, and we applaud that. But in other cases, his arguments, I think, were lacking, and his arguments fall into the same pitfalls many people in the past fell in that have enabled the current cultural and political and economic crisis that we have right now in the West that is fundamentally destroying the family, that is fundamentally destroying society, and that is making us less free, and also, by virtue of that, making us less virtuous. Reason, first principles, truth, universal values, those should be our yardstick, not the habits of the past for the sake of the past. In other words, reject Edmund Burke and embrace Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine. Reject simply romanticizing the past and embrace the good parts of the past while also leaving the bad parts to the side. Someone told me this a long time ago. Eat the meat, chew out the bones. That's probably the biggest takeaway I have from all of this. So no, the cancellation of Harrison Butker, or the attempted cancellation, I hope it does not succeed. It is ridiculous, it is asinine, it is illiberal, and it is wrong, and I hope it fails. But the idolization of Harrison Butker is equally dangerous for a different reason, because it leaves us vulnerable to pitfalls and fallacies that may actually harm our ability to protect America, to defend the truth, and also to defeat the cultural vanguards who are currently making Harrison Butker's life and his wife's life hell. To all of you who are trying to tear down this man, I hope that you fail, and you are an example of you're an example of everything every American should aspire not to be in their lives. To those of you who are trying to protect him and ensure that he is okay in terms of being able to express his opinions, Godspeed to you. I think you are well. but we should always have a critical mind to even those we agree with, because that is the only way we can truly learn, grow, and prosper as individuals and fundamentally as Americans, inheritors of the intellectual tradition of Americanism. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to make this video successful. If you enjoy political commentary with a philosophical lens, you can also, of course, share the video, comment, do all that as well. Donate to me if you want to. All that's in the comment section down below. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.